class in this room. Preacher here takes off his jacket. He's standing right here, blanket.
I may have to come to this Bible class if I can't.
Tell you what, I'll hang out up here. You do any copy signing? Will you do that?
I'm talking to hearing people, so
Right, you've got 2 hearing elders. 3. You've got 3 hearing elders.
but that people always like
Oh, it's got stuff to say. And you're the only class right now.
yeah, I know.
So it's either you or no more, so we see each other.
Now, see, I would have went home.
Why not?
Right behind you, or do we just start? Start?
Sure.
I have to keep one to the chair.
Yeah, is it recording? We have to tell it to record.
Okay, I'm almost ready to start. I'm going to be speaking mostly to the hearing, to the elders. That's my focus of this class. But if you're a deaf, want to be in here, that's fine. I can't stand because I ripped my knee. And so I'll be sitting here signing. So if you can't see me, we have plenty of chairs. Move to where you can see me. And can you hear me fine? Hear me fine? Okay. So this lesson that I'm going to give and to talk about some things, I want it to be more of a dialogue. But it's a lesson that I give every time they give me the opportunity to talk to the hearing students at Sunset International Bible Institute. There I always talk about this. It's given a little bit of deaf culture, deaf background, some things about deafness to help people to understand, because our focus is on deaf ministry. And so you need to understand some things about the deaf to understand that. And I always like to give the idea to start when you think about what it'd be like to be born deaf. Now, most of you know what it's like to be born deaf. But for some of us, we don't. And so, but you imagine you're born and then you come into a world where everyone's looking at you and they're looking at you and go, oh, he's so cute and everything. But they're not saying, you can't hear anything. It's just what you see is, right? And that's your world. And so then all of a sudden, as time goes on, you begin to realize that, you know, I may need an interpreter. It might be easier.
I would be happy to interpret,
Okay.
sure.
Okay. That's the way we do it at Sunset, isn't it?
That's right, just switch plans.
That's right.
No.
When you get older, the parents begin to realize that here's a child who you know, they're not responding when you're vacuuming the floor or you're making loud noises. This baby's not responding at all. And then all of a sudden they take this baby and they go to the doctor and they say, we don't know what's wrong with this baby. There's something wrong with this baby. And so we need to find out what's wrong with this baby. And they begin doing all these tests on you as you're a baby and checking all these things. And they find out, well, he's deaf. Well, then that's just a traumatic experience for the parents. Oh, what are we going to do? We got this deaf child. What are we going to do with this deaf child? We know nothing about deafness. We don't. And the doctor's like, well, we can get you some counseling. You can go see a counselor to figure out how to deal with having a deaf child. And here we can do all these types of things like medically and different things like that to help you to deal with this. And so the deafness is a problem instead of a blessing. And so they view it as something that's a negative. And so here you're a child that you're going to grow up with. That's the view, that you're going off and you're being tested all the time and trying to figure out what's wrong with this child. And then when it comes time to teach the child, there's so many different views. They talked about the difference between ASL and PSE and all this SE signs and different things. And so then they're going to tell you things like, you don't want to sign to this child because it's going to be a crutch, for this child. He'll be dependent upon these signs. Mm-hmm. And so you got to just keep talking to them. We want this child to be oral, right? And all the deaf people are shaking their heads, right? You understand that. And so they want all these things and tell them all these things they got to do. And it's interesting to me, just a side note, that a lot of hearing parents learn sign language to sign to their babies because it helps the babies progress a lot faster. But yet if you have a deaf child, you're not supposed to sign to them at all. And because that is going to set them back. It's kind of oxymoronic. What's the sign for that? Oxymoronic? There's some things I want to share with you about deafness. And this is in a culture class that I teach. But it's called the 90% rule. And this is what they've come up with. But these are statistics about the reality of deafness. 90% of deaf children are born to hearing parents. 90%.
Have deaf parents?
Hearing parents. Hearing parents. Deaf children are born to hearing parents. And 90% of these hearing parents have never been around deaf people. So you can see that out of the 90% of children born to hearing parents, and those parents, 90% of them have no clue about deafness or about deaf culture or being around deaf people. 90 to 92% of hearing parents are unable to communicate with their deaf children, meaning they do not sign. And it's even worse when it comes to the fathers. The statistic is much higher of hearing fathers who do not sign to their deaf children.
That's right.
It's only 2% of hearing fathers who learn to communicate with their deaf children.
Profile.
Wow.
Okay? 90% of deaf children do not attend a deaf school where they can interact with other deaf children. So 90% of them are mainstreamed. They're put into the public school systems these days. 90% of deaf children raised by hearing parents experience significant delays in communication and education.
I'm one of those children.
You know?
Yep, me too. And Jerry, I'm sorry. Those mainstream kids, you meet them after they graduate and they're so isolated, and you try to befriend them and they can't communicate with you. They don't want to socialize, and I just would rather see them become socialized younger.
It's hard because they're not integrated into the deaf culture. And for many of them, it takes a long time for them to adjust. And then they go through, and we'll talk about it a little bit, they're going to go through a lot of psychological issues because of those things. Like imagine not having a father who communicates with you, or growing up in a system where you're the problem. There's something wrong with you all the time. And so then when they begin to realize that there's a deaf culture out there and there's a deaf community out there, they get angry and they're frustrated. And why was I not taught these things? Why am I now learning these things? And so there's a lot of frustration you're gonna find in the deaf community.
That's true. That happened to me.
I need to take these people to Sunset with me, and they can amen everything I say.
We will. We'll do that loudly. I second that motion from Rob.
90% of deaf children are unable to obtain intelligible speech in spite of years of intensive therapy. And so they do a lot of training in oral communication, things like that, but for most of them it just does not work. Does not work. And so you can see with those statistics the effects that it's going to have psychologically. You can see what it's like even going to church. I mean, imagine you're a deaf child going to church, and I'm sure we'll get a lot of amens for this. Going into church, and you just go up there, and what you see is, there's people that sometimes they stand, sometimes they sit, sometimes they're all moving their voices, sometimes they're not. You get a guy up there, and he starts yelling at everybody, and then they hand him a piece of cracker and some grape juice, and then they take money, and it's probably to make that guy happy who was yelling at him earlier. And so there's those kinds of things, and that's what they experience. They have no clue what's going on in church and what is taking place, and no one speaking to them in their language. And so all those effects that it has on the deaf community, we need to realize that as we begin to think about deaf ministry and working with the deaf, that those things are in place. I want to give some generalizations. When I say generalizations, it means generally this is true for deaf people. But again, just like all generalizations are, they're not always true for everybody. Okay, that's like when I lived in Mexico, everybody said Americans were loud and obnoxious. And most of the Americans who come off the cruise ships are loud and obnoxious, but we weren't one of those type of people. So it wasn't everybody is that way, but it's generally that way. Some things you need to understand about deaf people. Deaf people typically struggle to read.
The Alabama sign for rude, which I used for obnoxious, was new to several people. So we had that conversation. Rude.
Rude.
Rude. That is.
It's rude in Texas.
Rude in Texas. All right. Okay.
Okay.
Rude. Okay.
So
sorry about that.
That's okay.
Can't read.
Deaf people typically struggle to read. And the reason for that is English is their second language. It's not their first language. ASL is their heart language. It's the language that they really communicate with, most deaf people. And communication is based upon visual than it is on just words on a page. It's based on facial expression. It's on the signs and different things like that. It's a visual language where they communicate. Contrary to popular belief, ASL is not English on the hands. And that's where a lot of hearing people will have these misconceptions that there's a sign for every single English word. And there's not. Just like there's not an English word for every sign there is. Because there are a lot of signs that you can't really put them into English. But you understand them if you understand ASL. And there's some things we say in English that make absolutely no sense in ASL. And so we need to understand that when we're communicating with them. We know that there's 250 to 300 million deaf people in the world. And 70, that includes deaf, hard of hearing, etc. That's a huge category. But there are 70 million people who use sign language to communicate as their language. Sign language. Now, that doesn't mean 70 million people speak in ASL. Because ASL is not universal, even though most people think there's only one sign language in the world and all people in the world speak ASL. They don't. There's actually, they say there's 400 different sign languages in the world. For example, ASL and British Sign Language are extremely different, even though they both speak English. And so we have a manual alphabet where we do it with one hand, like A, B, C, D, E. And in Britain, they do it with two hands, and the vowels are on the fingers, A, E, I, O, U. And then it's like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and all those kinds of things. And so even though we speak the same language in English, the sign languages are very different. It's very difficult. It's harder to communicate. Although deaf people can communicate a lot faster than people who speak different languages can. Mexican Sign Language, or what we call LSM, and Honduran Sign Language, for example, are very different, even though they both speak Spanish. Mexican Sign Language is they have their own sign language, and it's pretty set. But in Honduras, they didn't have a sign language for so many years, and when the people came in, they taught them ASL. And so a lot of their language is very ASL based, even though it's Spanish. And so those are important things to understand. It's important to understand that many countries view deafness as a curse from God, as they've been punished. And so typically when a family...
I've heard that. Several people have heard that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. In your country, in Nigeria.
It's true in Nigeria. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so the deaf children are typically hidden because they don't want people to know they have a deaf child, because then people are going to know that they're cursed. And so...
My microphone.
Okay.
I hear you better.
And so that's typical. I know that they told me in some countries in Africa they used to take the children and tie them out to a tree in the jungle if they found out they were deaf, so the animals would come and eat them and get rid of them. So you can see how those countries view it. I know that in Honduras.
Sherry. Mm-hmm.
Now in Honduras, I know about Honduras because that's where my son was and my daughter works there now. And so they take those children who are deaf, and they typically are the ones that do all the housework, and they stay at home all the time. They don't get any education, and that's how they're treated. So I want to share those things psychologically, the generalizations about deaf, but I want you to realize this as you're thinking about working with deaf. If we take a room in here, and I don't know how many people we have in this room. We've got about...
Counting.
Rob's counting for us. 26, 27. So if we got 26 or 27 deaf people, probably only one has heard about Jesus. Because 98% of deaf people have never heard about Christ.
Wow. Profound number.
It's a big number. It is the second largest unchurched group in the world. I think China's probably the first. Because there's deaf people all over the world. There's deaf people in every community. How do you sign China?
That was a reference to the last class.
I'm really sorry.
Yes.
Wow.
I put a ball in there.
China.
China. We'll do it all.
That's the politically correct problem.
Yes. And so you can see we've got a lot of work. And 98% of deaf people are unchurched. They don't know about Jesus. And so there's opportunities all over. Every time I hear that number and think about it, and in the work that I do with training deaf men and women to teach, it reminds me of what Jesus said when he said the fields are white unto harvest, but the laborers are few. said 98% out of America, no, in the world.
All over the world.
All over the world.
Wow.
Yeah.
We gotta spread the word, Rob says.
I got that right.
We got a lot of work to do.
I see that.
Yeah.
Come to Sunset. And schools for the deaf need to hear about the church.
Yeah. But it's harder to go into the schools for the deaf now because of all the rules and the laws, and they've changed things. It's hard to go in now.
Oh,
Yeah.
schools for the deaf. Yeah, they don't allow you now. Even the Boy Scouts aren't allowed at the schools for the deaf now. They've really tightened up. They're not allowed at schools. So churches are definitely prohibited from going into schools. But God is looking at us and not allowing deaf people to learn by hearing preaching. What's God going to do with their souls?
It's a good question. We got a lot of work to do.
Mm-hmm.
I want to share some about.
Gertie's saying in St. Louis, Missouri, there's no sighting allowed. It's all oral in St. Louis. Mm-hmm. It's oral system only.
I'm going to share a little about some deaf works that have taken place that we are involved in or know about in Ethiopia. The deaf work was begun there because the king's daughter granted some land to the church if they would do something for the people. And so they decided to set up a deaf school in Ethiopia. And then when they set up the deaf school in Ethiopia, then they were allowed to establish churches and schools of preaching. And so that's how a lot of the work that the Church of Christ does in Ethiopia began, was because they went in doing deaf ministry and teaching deaf people. And they're doing some great work there with the deaf.
Is that current?
Yeah, they're still doing it. Mexico City has around 1 million deaf people in Mexico. And the reason for that is because all the deaf people who are born into the rural areas will end up migrating into Mexico City because that's where all the work and the opportunities are. And so just a few years ago, the brother who will be speaking tonight, Mike Cantrell, is our first deaf missionary that we've sent into the mission field, and he lives and works in Mexico City with his wife Kim. And so I asked him, since I'm voicing tonight, not to be signing an LSM, Mexican Sign Language, but to sign an ASL. So hopefully
Your Spanish isn't that good?
well, my LSM's not that good. Just recently, the work in Honduras. We're doing some work in Honduras, in Santa Rosa de Copan, which is in western Honduras. And that was started by some young students. One of those students was my son, Rex, who went down there, and one of his friends, and they ended up meeting some deaf people there, and then my daughter went down there to work, and they met, and when we went to church there and visited, they had 2 young deaf ladies that were attending church. One of the young deaf girls ended up baptizing her parents because we had an opportunity, because they saw somebody that cared about their deaf daughter. She was about 8 years old at that time, and one of the things you need to know about deaf is that the Jehovah's Witnesses are huge in the deaf ministry right now. And they're all over the place. But in this town, they would go in and they would teach sign language. Since there's no education for deaf people, they'd go in and teach sign language But one of the prerequisites, or after 8 weeks of sign language study, you had to convert and become a Jehovah's Witness. Because if you didn't convert and become a Jehovah's Witness, then you could no longer study sign language with them. And so then when the group that my children were involved in came in, they started teaching sign language. And so they handed them, manuals, the sign language books and things like that. And the guy was like, how long do we get to study with you before we have to make a decision? And they said, what do you mean? They said, well, the Jehovah's Witnesses, we have to decide after 8 weeks. They said, no, we're not doing this to make you make a decision. Your decision to follow Christ is between you and him. We're just trying to help you learn sign language. And so that couple ended up being baptized and are strong members of that congregation now. And so when we got there, I took one of my deaf students with me who was from Mexico City. And we got there, and they just had the 2 little deaf girls on the first Sunday. On the next Sunday, we finally met some of the other deaf people in the community, and we said, can we, after church, can we go around and start meeting all the deaf people? And he said, sure, we can do that. And so we had that planned. Well, we were sitting at the bus place where the bus would pick us up to take us to church, and all of a sudden this big crowd of people come walking towards the bus. And there was like 8 deaf people that showed up in that crowd, because he had went out, this guy who was not a member of the church, he had went out and got all his deaf friends and said, there's a deaf guy here, come on, let's go to church. And so they showed up at church that day. And so then right after that, I met with the guy who runs the mission there, and he said, what do we need to do? Well, there's no education for the deaf in Honduras. Very little to none. They can't read, they can't write. And I said, well, if you really want to have a sustainable deaf ministry and make a difference, you're going to have to open a deaf school. And so he said, okay, let's do it. And so we met with the government and got the things we needed to do to put that in place. And they're now in their 3rd year of school there, and they have about 30 students or so there in the school. And the church has 11 deaf members. And we have a deaf missionary there that works there with that group. And so that's pretty exciting. Currently we got a deaf brother in Nicaragua who is studying with us. He studies with us online. And so there's just opportunity after opportunity everywhere we go. And we just have so much opportunity in deaf ministry and deaf missions. If you go into a community and you can meet one deaf person, you can find all the other deaf people. Because the deaf people know where all the other deaf people are. So there's an opportunity there. But one of the things I want to help elders to see and churches to see and mission committees to see is when you get an opportunity to get involved in that deaf person's life, you then have an opportunity to work with everybody that loves that deaf person, which is usually hearing parents, hearing brothers and sisters, cousins, uncles, those kinds of things. The doors open up, and it's a lot easier to get into those doors because you've already loved somebody that they love. I remember one of the days my daughter called me up, and she's young, 21. She calls me up and she says, Dad, I got something to tell you. And that's one of those, okay, did she just get married? What did she do? I don't know what's going on. And so she calls me up and she says, we embalmed a guy today. Embalmed, like when somebody dies, you prepare them for burial. And so I was like, you did what? She lives in Honduras. And she was working in a school system there, and one of the deaf guys in the school, his grandfather had passed away. And it was next to the school, so they went over and visited the family, and the family was talking to them about how much it was going to cost them to get him involved and prepared for burial. And it was going to cost them like $100 or something from the funeral home. But the lady that was with her knew how to do all those things because she was a nurse, and she could go down to the pharmacy and get the materials they needed to do it for like $10. And so they said, we'll do it for you. And so they did it for them. Now, I tell you that story just to say, what kind of an impact do you think they had on that family that day? and what kind of difference are they going to make in that hearing family because they loved this deaf guy and did that for his grandfather. And so the opportunities are endless, and we have to, when we look at deaf ministry, we've got to see past just, here's just this little deaf group and we're going to have them here. We've got to see the opportunities and the doors that God's going to open for us on the other side of that. The things that God can do with the people who are connected with those deaf people. Whereas I've got an open door with them because I love this deaf person instead of just trying to meet the hearing people off the street. And so the evangelism opportunities are great. So what can we do? I've got down here just a few things. We need to learn to communicate with deaf people. We need to make an effort to learn sign language. And if you can't do that, deaf people can write. They can type. They have little things on the phone now with these smartphones. They've got deals where you can turn on the voice recorder, and as you speak, it'll transcribe everything you say out, and they can read it. Wow. And then they can type back to you. So there's lots of things. You can make gestures. I mean, a lot of sign language is just logical. It makes sense. And you can try to make up signs to communicate, but learn to communicate with the deaf people at every opportunity that you get. Connect with deaf people who have other deaf people that can help. If you are trying to do a ministry, get a hold of me and let me see what I can do to help you. We have deaf people all over the place who don't have churches to attend. And so, unfortunately, what we've had to do is start streaming some of our classes and things like that, where we have our Bible class and our sermons on Sunday, because that's the only opportunity they get to have a worship service, is to be able to watch that. Now, it's not, I don't think it's the way God wants it to be or is the best thing. I think God would want them to be involved in a family, but it's what we have right now. But get involved with people who can help you reach out to the deaf people and to help work with the deaf people. Contribute to deaf work. Get trained in deaf ministry, which is something we do. Christian interpreters. I want to talk a little bit about interpreters just a little bit. I think that a lot of times churches, they'll say, well, just bring in a professional interpreter. I think that that's risky. I think if it's the only thing you can do, it's the best thing you got, then you need to do that. But we need to have Christian interpreters who are trained, because there are some signs that professional interpreter might sign something based upon their background that would not fit what we believe. For example, if we were talking about baptism, we use obviously the sign where we baptize somebody, we immerse somebody. But if I say that word to somebody with a different religious background, their sign for baptize might be this, to sprinkle. If I talk about making Jesus your Lord, some might use this sign, which is the sign they use to say, I ask Jesus to come into my heart, and those kinds of things. And so it is really important to have interpreters who understand the Bible, who are Christian interpreters and who have a vocabulary in sign language to be able to use and interpret properly what the Bible teaches. So I just wanted to share some of these things and some of these ideals and encourage people to be involved in deaf ministry. I work with Sunset International Bible Institute in the deaf ministry program. I train deaf ministers. I train deaf teachers. I get calls all the time for people needing ministers, for people on the mission field need somebody to come and work with their deaf, those kinds of things. But if anytime you want to talk to me, if you have any questions or anything like that, we'll take some time. We got a few minutes. We'll take some questions for anybody that has any questions. But get a hold of me, and I'd love to talk with you, and I'd love to visit with you about what we can do in deaf ministry, and not just here in this congregation, but in any congregation, and not just in the United States, but what we can do in the world as we try to reach out to deaf people all over the world. Okay, so anyone have any questions right now?
We have a ministry at 53rd Avenue Church of Christ in Florida. I would love to have you come down and tell the elders this is need in the deaf community. They knew nothing about deaf people.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to go talk with the elders. I don't want to tell them anything.
Oh.
But I'd love to talk with the elders if they invite me to come and talk with them. Yeah.
I've got something. You said 90% of fathers cannot sign to their children, but Barbara is one of the special ones who could sign. Her mother would not sign with the deaf children, but the father did.
Yeah. So she had a special father.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
That's wonderful.
And we created home signs, and they created home signs, and he would get in, but mother wouldn't have anything to do with it. She only thought the kids should speak and read lips. I got something. I have a question. I'm a little confused because I know that my parents love me. I know that. They don't sign any at all, but they attempt to communicate with few gestures. Now my dad, he's more like he'll read it, he'll write, and it's in broken English, but I don't write well to him. But we understand when we write back and forth. We understand those notes. But my mother is not that way because she's a very intelligent woman, and she majored in English. My dad is a business major. That's what his master's degree is in. But he understands me better than Mom did growing up. So now I'm here in America, and I'm learning that parents should learn to sign and talk with a deaf person and develop a relationship. And I go, wow. Did we have a relationship or did we not? Because my dad loves me. When I asked for things that I needed, he took care of those needs. And so is that a good relationship, or would you not call that a good relationship?
No, I'd call that a good relationship. But I'm just saying these are the facts of the percentage of what happens there. 90% don't learn sign language. Does it mean they don't love them?
My family
Doesn't
didn't.
mean that. Doesn't always mean that. But if they're not communicating, it's harder.
Yeah,
That's what it means.
I understand.
Some parents think they can show love to their children by teaching them orally because they're told it's the best thing. So
But it's
some
not.
show love that way, some other ways. They're still trying to show love, but it's a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Let me get up here and try something. I was deaf all my life. I was in the hearing school first because my mother heard different stories that children go to deaf school, never get education. By the time I was 13, my mother took me out of a hearing school because the hearing school don't know how to teach the deaf. Put me in a deaf school. That was the stylist in my life. Then later, there was one deaf man transferred from another deaf school or only. And that boy came, he doesn't know sign language, he doesn't know English, I was shocked. All doesn't work. And his education is gone, waste.
Irene says, I have a funny story. It's not really funny, but it is ironic. When a mother has a baby and find out that that baby is blind, they find a way to teach that baby to mobility devices, Braille, and train that child so that that child can live independently. Another mother has a baby who is paralyzed, And so we learn adaptive methods. Maybe we use a wheelchair or other equipment that facilitates their needs. So you can go through a variety of disabilities, but then when it comes to a deaf baby, you're going to force them to be just like the hearing people. We're going to stick something in your head so you can hear. And they don't accommodate to what we need, but they instead try to make us like them, and I find that very ironic. Yeah. So I have a question. Does Sunset have a sponsorship for missionary work? Do you sponsor
The church,
missionaries?
the church supports, at Sunset, the church supports Mike and Kim.
They do?
What do you mean?
Just
only
the church? What do you mean? I mean, are there other foundations that will sponsor a deaf work?
Well, the church supports deaf missions.
So like, the Ford Foundation or Lincoln Foundation. There are a lot of different foundations out there. And they may have a deaf or a deaf-blind emphasis. And like my wife is low vision, Barbara is deaf-blind. And I wonder if they would sponsor, why don't we ask those types of foundations for their help? Because my understanding is that they have their list of rules that they follow, and that's what their philanthropy is, and that's where their funds go. Their donations go to that. So you never know.
We've never tried that.
But you say that, the laborers are few.
Laborers are few, yeah.
And the fields are white.
Yeah.
And like you said, 90%
Well,
don't know.
98%.
Oh, 98, excuse me, 98%. And that's too
So
much.
we're trying. Hey, we need help. Hey, we need help. Have people come, hey, help us. Help us. I don't have anyone.
I
They're
understand
looking for a
that.
deaf preacher in Dallas. They're looking for a deaf preacher in maybe Birmingham, I heard, maybe. In Fort Worth there. And I'm training as many as we can, but we don't have the men who are volunteering.
Who works with you?
Mark Lowenstein,
So it's just the two of you?
2 of us.
No one else? That's a big headache. That is,
He's
big
my
headache.
biggest headache right there.
Wow.
How many students do you train each year to become a preacher?
Maybe I'd say around 8, 10.
That's small
That's
number.
very small.
I'm just,
And all of our preachers have been preaching for many years, and they're retiring. They're getting old, and so we need new ones.
you need a young one.
Well, we need anyone.
Well, I'm 81, I don't mind.
I am one of the new students at Sunset. Yes, I'll move. Sorry about that. I'm one of the new students at Sunset, first year. And we have some others here. Jim has been a former student. Tara's there. What is your name? I graduated. But anyway, we've had several people here who are former students of Sunset. So I think there are 8 of us in this room. And let me tell you, it's very much worth the experience. And
Jose referred to me.
Jose referred me to Sunset, and I am very thankful to be there. Thank you, Dennis. But and the other thing about Sunset is that you do have to have 2 internships or mission programs. So I will travel to foreign countries to do that, and that's worthwhile. And the school is cheap, but there's a lot of work. Let me tell you, there's a lot of school work. But if it weren't for this school, I wouldn't be here at workshop. I wouldn't have met the people in this room, right? Right? And it's $20 per class. Come on. But it is a time investment. There's a lot of study and a lot to do, but it is so valuable. And I praise the Lord for Dennis, my teacher. Wow.
He already got his grade, so.
So that means that deaf ministry, we've got old people need to go to schools and universities where deaf students are and teach God's word to set up.
Yeah. Okay, our time's up. If you have any questions, you want to talk to me while I'm here, I'd love to talk with you.
No.
Thank you.
Last minute I was coming home.
Glenn went home.
Yeah.
She went home.
No, I didn't. Forgot what I didn't do. Please God.
Thank you.
I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you.
Okay.